For those of us outside the US and outside the Washington bubble, can we start with a few general questions? How do you describe Donald Trump and his character? And is he really so different from all the past American presidents? And if so, in what way?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I think this is the first time that we've done this sort of brothers working together. I'm very grateful for the invitation, and I'm glad to be here. The first things to say are perhaps kind of rather obvious, the things that are very evident about Donald Trump to a lot of people. He's crude, he's overbearing, boastful, capricious, and very unlearned. Those are sort of negative qualities that make him a highly divisive character. But perhaps more interesting will be the things that I can say which are his strengths. He's exceptionally resilient and, in a way, almost brave in the way he's willing to just argue toe to toe with people. He's very canny, insightful about what's political, what will work politically, and he's witty. And the final thing that I want to say about him, about his character, which is perhaps not recognizable, particularly to people who are abroad, is that he's charismatic. By that, I don't mean that he's necessarily a likable person. Obviously, people do like him. A lot of them do. But I'll mention a couple of things that experiences I've had which will demonstrate perhaps that charisma. One was when I first met him. It was probably 5, 6, 7 years ago at the White House Correspondents Association dinner. It's not a gathering which is generally conservative or Republican, but I watched him, and the thing that it reminded me of was of that sort of game, child's game, where you move a magnet around under a card which has iron filings on it. He moved around the room, or any room he was in, and there were people who wanted to be with him, wanted to follow him, wanted to ask him questions, and it wasn't just journalists. He just has some kind of magnetism, which perhaps as well as being repellent to a lot of people. The other thing that I remember was during the 2015, after he'd announced to run for the presidency, and during 2016, we in the newsroom would watch him and others in the primary debates on stage and talking. And I remember there was one of my senior editors, a deputy of mine, who, when Donald Trump became the nominee, publicly resigned from his membership of the Republican Party. He's a never Trumper. But I remember that on several occasions when he was watching the debates, he would laugh with enjoyment at what Donald Trump was saying, not mocking, laughing, how silly this guy is, but he was drawn in by Trump's humor. Now, so he's charismatic. It makes him obviously extremely divisive because he has very strong, he has considerable strengths as well as having considerable, ugly characteristics. He's thoroughly unpresidential and unconventional, but actually that's one of the things that a lot of people who like him like about him. Sometimes he appeals to them as a sledgehammer, and a sledgehammer is sometimes the right tool for the job. And there are a lot of people who think that a sledgehammer is the right tool for the job in Washington, or became that right tool. There are a lot of people in the country who are heartily sick of the way that the country is moving, intersectionality, postmodern political correctness, and they relish his rhetoric. They love the fact that he flouts the new orthodoxies and will troll his adversaries. One other thing I would say, I guess, is Trump is obviously very highly self-centered. And I remember watching and being appalled when he was at the Helsinki summit, I think it was 2017, and he was asked questions about Russian interference. I think Putin was standing right next to him at a separate podium. He was asked about Russian interference in the 2016 election. And he could not separate, or would not separate, what was personal to him from, he could not make an objective observation. He could have said, yes, Russia did interfere in the election. Everybody has already established that. but I won fair and square. Because he felt, or I interpreted it as because he felt that anything to suggest that would taint his win, he could not admit the obvious fact that Russia had tried to influence the election. It was an awful performance. It stood out, but it's not an isolated incident. So, I mean, I suppose that's the way I would describe him.
Okay, that's great. Can you describe a little bit about the White House and how it's organized, who his key advisors are, both family and outside the family, and the decision-making process?
Yes, indeed. In fact, there is one thought. I'll come back to the first question. I interviewed Donald Trump. You also asked whether he was entirely different from others. I think he is sui generis. I interviewed Donald Trump about 6 to 8 months ago in the Oval Office, and he pointed out one portrait on the wall, which was of Andrew Jackson. He had particularly asked for that picture to come to the office, and in some ways he's not unlike Jackson in that he's sort of irascible, populist, somewhat vulgar. But he admires Jackson, and I think it was fairly pointed that he wanted Jackson sort of looking down over his shoulder during his presidency. At the White House, I think it's organized largely as other White Houses have been. They all have their idiosyncrasies and favorites. And I can't say with complete confidence how much more or less he delegates than other presidents. He places a lot of trust in his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who has important oversight and creative roles in the re-election, in Middle East policy, and in the response to the pandemic and the opening up of the economy. Jared's wife, Donald Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump, influences the president on social matters. She was very important in his move towards criminal justice reform, which was a clever political thing, which it's popular with black voters, and that is dangerous to Joe Biden. As far as having family members being close advisors and senior in the White House, it's not that unusual. You'll probably remember that Bill Clinton put Hillary Clinton in charge of healthcare reform. I mean, that collapsed and died, but nevertheless, she was running his efforts to reform healthcare for about a year. JFK appointed his brother Bobby as Attorney General. So it's not that unusual to have families mixed into the structure of an administration.
All right. And the relationship between the White House and the Republican Party and the Senate, the Republican-controlled Senate. Again, it's people and its factions. And also why the Republican Party appears to give Trump carte blanche. Is it because of his political coattails, his unique use of social media, or why?
Well, certainly Donald Trump's popularity with Republicans across the country is extremely important. He has support amongst Republicans in the mid-90s. I believe that 96% was the last figure that I saw in polling. So Republican senators are unavoidably aware of that, and they have to gauge their adherence or opposition to the president in part because of that. The most important Republican in the Senate is the leader, Mitch McConnell, whose character is about as far removed, 180 degrees from Donald Trump's as it's possible to be. He's entirely uncharismatic, and he's a master of detail and procedure. But actually, he's been very helpful to the president. One of the most notable things he did was to pick up the precedent established by Harry Reid, the Democratic majority leader of the past, to limit the scope of filibusters, and Mitch McConnell eliminated the filibuster for judicial nominees, and that allowed the confirmation of two textualists, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, and has changed the complexion of the Supreme Court, which is one of the things that is enormously popular amongst conservatives across the country, even when they have grave reservations about Donald Trump in various other ways. There was a decision actually only yesterday which rather shocked conservatives on which kind of expanded the scope of the Civil Rights Act And so there is some second guessing on the nature of the judiciary because of that. But broadly speaking, it's been very popular. He's changed, he's probably staffed about 1/3 of the federal bench, and this will have consequences and ripples all the way through about the next 3 decades. So it's been a huge help to Trump that Mitch McConnell has given him. Other important senators, particularly notable, are Senators Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, and Marco Rubio, all of whom were bitter enemies, but have become effective allies. That's largely because of the policies that Trump has introduced. I don't think any of them particularly likes him. At the opposite end of the spectrum are Senators Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski of Maine and Alaska. They keep their distance from Trump. Their states are not they're on the left of their own party, and they're they keep their distance because their states aren't sort of very conservative. But they see positives in Trump. Collins, it was, who made the most important speech and cast the most important vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. And Lisa Murkowski of Alaska is delighted by Trump's support of the energy industry and his encouragement of exports, which had previously been banned. It was very odd. She endorsed General James Mattis's suggestion recently that Trump is a threat to the Constitution, and yet she's still not sure whether she'll support him or oppose him. So anyway, the Senate Republicans are increasingly loyal. They don't, I think a lot of them like his character and they dislike it. And it reminds me of a conference I was at about 6 to 9 months ago, where I asked the audience whether, and it was a very Trumpy audience, they supported him a lot, but they also, about 3/4 of them put up their hand when I said, would you like him to tweet less and less outrageously? So there's mixed feelings in the Senate.
All right, that's great. Can you talk a little bit about the House, obviously controlled by the Democrats, again, the key individuals, the relationship, etc.?
Yeah, sure. Well, his relations with the House could hardly be worse. I think he and Nancy Pelosi detest each other and hold each other in mutual contempt. But pretty much every Democrat in the House does. Ironically, that could help vote Trump, because I think that a lot of them, particularly his base, is to some extent motivated by the opposition from the House, which they see as something of an obsession. If it were more modulated and more varied, then perhaps they would think it was more considered. But I think they think it's just a reflexive hatred of Trump and a determination to say he's illegitimate. Impeachment has long, for several years, looked like the destination that the Democrats wanted, and their only real problem was which path they would take to it. It's very notable that, and people, it's now been exposed that although they were coming out on TV and saying there's more than circumstantial evidence of collusion with Russia on his campaign, it's now the transcripts of their private testimony was declassified, and it's now shown that every single one of them acknowledged that they had no hard evidence of collusion. So the partisanship which drove the opposition to Trump has been pretty clearly exposed. They turned from collusion to the phone call with Ukraine. They impeached him. He has the scarlet letter I now attached to him, like Clinton and Andrew Johnson in the past. Nancy Pelosi resisted the push for impeachment, which came from her left in her party, because remembering 1998 and how that backfired on the Republicans, she feared that it would backfire electorally on the Democrats. But eventually the pressure to impeach, and also you could say the evidence of the phone call, made it difficult for her to resist, and so she embraced that.
Yeah. Okay, if we can move on now to the governors. Again, the important ones, the relationship between them, etc.
Yeah. I have to admit that I'm not nearly as clued into the relationship with the governors, and I'm not sure I can make generalizations. Certainly, Trump's relationship with governors varies enormously. Just to take an example, you know, he's Jay Inslee of Washington. I mean, Trump was recently insulting him over the Capitol Hill, the sort of little statelet that some left-wing activists have set up in central Seattle. Jay Inslee ran for the Democratic nomination very unsuccessfully. Was a weak candidate, but I mean, they heartily detest each other. At the other end of the spectrum, Ron DeSantis of Florida gets on very well with the president, is very Trumpy himself. After squabbles between Trump and Roy Cooper, the governor of North Carolina, where the Republicans were due to hold their convention, and indeed will just do a little bit of work there on the convention. They've moved the bulk of the convention to Jacksonville, Florida, and that's in part because Florida is an important state. Trump wants to win it. He's got the backing of the governor. So I don't know that I can make a sort of sweeping statement about it, but anyway, you know, individual governors, different relationships.
All right. And what about Trump's relationship with US business and the difference between large and small companies? Which sectors support him, which don't? And is he thought to have done a good job in his first term, or what?
Right. Well, until the pandemic hit, growth was generally faster under Trump than it had been under Obama. People had started suggesting that 2% growth was the new normal during the Obama presidency. And although for many quarters, even before the pandemic hit, it hadn't been much higher than 2% under Trump, there were quarters where it was growing at 3%. So I think that, I think that Trump is generally popular. It's mixed, his relationship with business, but generally popular. One of the things that businesses large and small generally have liked is that he has cut a lot of red tape. He made essentially his administration made a ruling or decided that they would be a ratio for every one regulation that was introduced, which was new, 2 would be cut. And for a long while, the ratio was actually 20 to 1. 20 were cut for every one which was introduced. And this was unheard of. You know, many years ago, I was talking with Tom DeLay, who was the chief whip in the House. And he said that it didn't make any difference whether there was a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. The number of regulations always went up. The pace at which they accumulated changed, but it was always upward. So what Donald Trump and his administration have done in cutting red tape is almost unheard of. The Chamber of Commerce, which represents big business, is delighted with this. They do worry about, I mean, they hedge their bets and they try to make sure that they are not too partisan because they have to work with whichever administration, whichever president is elected. But small businesses thrive too, and that's one of the reasons why why unemployment fell to very low levels in somewhere between 3% and 4%, and Black and Hispanic joblessness was lower than ever recorded. And I think that since 1948, I think is when the recording of that began. So again, that was something that would help Trump collecting minority votes, also helping to undermine Biden in some Midwestern states such as Wisconsin and Michigan, which were part of Hillary's supposed blue wall in the 2016 election, and that wall obviously collapsed. But there are some areas where business is not at all supportive of Trump. They don't like his tariffs. The trade war has hit farmers. Trump has tried to ameliorate the hit by sending subsidies to farmers, but that has not entirely made up for the loss of trade. China has actually just last month returned to being America's biggest trading partner, pushing ahead again of Mexico and Canada. So and farmers are getting some of the benefit from that. And there's also some intense support for him in farm country. I mean, I saw a photograph recently, a video from an airplane looking down on a field where the farmer was cropping his wheat in the name of Trump. So there's a lot that's popular there, but also it's mixed.
All right. Can we talk a bit about COVID-19 and both, his how he's coped with that, what the reaction is in the States, whether it's going to affect him in the election?
Yeah, sure. Well, his response has been, by general agreement, being muddled and incoherent, and it's been presented in an extraordinarily boastful and self-centered way. It's sort of depicted far too often as a kind of political rather than a policy matter. I think that Trump being early to try and to call for the reopening of the economy and get it back as near to normal as is possible was fairly canny, to use the adjective that I used before, because that was the direction that people clearly would be moving in. I think a lot of people, got heartily sick of being cooped up, and they wanted to get back to work. And by the way, I suspect that being cooped up actually contributed to a lot to the ferocity of the street violence that we've seen in the last month. Let me see. I think that at present, well, one of the things that has happened is that, as you know, the COVID has hit elderly people much more than younger people. And so Trump's chaotic response seems to be behind a decline in his support amongst elderly voters. And I think that's extremely important, because they were absolutely crucial to his victory in 2016. So whether that affects I suspect that his support amongst older voters will decline this coming election. And partly that will be a result of his handling of COVID-19. His overall polling has declined, and he's behind. And I think it's partly because of the last 3 months.
All right, can we move on perhaps to the issue of race and what's been happening recently in the States, and the non-white or the minority Americans' view of Trump, and whether that's going to be important in the election?
It's going to be absolutely vital in the election. Democratic presidential candidates need to secure the vast majority, and I'm talking here of, they collect 90% of black votes. I think Donald Trump managed to get 8% of black votes in 2016. But he has, I'll come to what's happened in the last month in a minute, but to talk about his presidency as a whole, he's done a lot to try and secure black votes. I mentioned criminal justice reform. There are people who talk about the possibility of Trump getting up to 20% of black votes. Now, I don't think it will be that high. I think that's very optimistic, and that was the number that was talked about before the last several weeks of racial protests. But he has some prominent, there are more and more black people, African Americans, who are willing to say that they support Trump. And that's partly because very prominent black people, such as Kanye West, have been openly supportive of Trump, and they are willing to appear with Trump, and they wear the MAGA hats. And I think that has been influential. So both on policy and because they're the prominent and popular African Americans who've been willing to say that they support Trump, I think that that is actually one of the key votes to watch. I think if Donald Trump wins in November, it will be because there isn't such a lockstep vote amongst African Americans for Joe Biden, although Joe Biden is popular with African Americans. It's very difficult to say how the unrest of the last month will help, will affect the vote. I think that it will actually make the vote more intense, if I put it that way. There will be a lot of people who see these the unrest and the street violence, and will be repelled by the party with which they associate that. And I think that they see that the people who are smashing businesses and that sort of thing are on the left. So as in 1968 and as in 1980, they may turn, some of them anyway, those who react that way will perhaps turn to the Republican, who they believe might, I don't know, make America great again, or return to something like normalcy. On the other hand, the death of George Floyd and the video of it showed something which most people regard as so appalling and egregious that they may say we need the party which is more likely to produce police reform, which I think actually people across the spectrum believe is necessary. And I don't know how much President Trump has his response has been to say that he's very much for law and order. He's betting that people will want a president who is for law and order. He's tempered that to some extent about talking about the reform of the police, holding officers who are racially violent accountable. Exactly how that turns out, I don't know, but certainly precedent would suggest that when businesses are being smashed and when protesters are, as they are, talking about going out into suburbia and threatening middle-class people, the voters tend to become more conservative. So that might help Trump.
Okay, I wonder whether you can talk about the fault line between generations, and perhaps the more socially conservative older generation, baby boomers, and the more socially liberal millennials, and whether how that's going to play out in the election, and and will they go out and vote?
Elderly people tend to vote in greater numbers than younger people, and so turnout is going to be important. I think that there is an intensity on both sides, and there was an intensity in 2016 on the conservative or the Republican side, but not on the Democratic side. So the fact that there's intensity on both sides now, I think could help Joe Biden. Younger voters certainly are further to the left, I think, in the United States, just as they are probably in most places. As I mentioned, Joe Biden's support has gone up amongst elderly voters, and Trump's has declined, which is a profound threat to Trump. He didn't win by very much last time, and as you know, the popular vote was, he lost the popular vote by 3 million, but won 30 of the 50 states. I think there will be lopsided votes for Democrats amongst those who vote, the millennials who vote, but whether they go out and vote in large numbers is a big question, because Joe Biden, like Hillary Clinton, is not somebody about whom the those on the further left are at all enthusiastic, and they tend to think of Biden as being conservative. So that could mean that a lot of them don't go to the polls. On the other hand, as I say, elderly people do go to the polls in higher numbers, and fewer of them now support Trump than they did. So that, I think, is probably the split.
Okay, they were all general questions, and you've answered many of the subsequent questions in a way. But can you say something about Trump's support base, what their priorities are, and also Trump's domestic policies and priorities, and whether it's aimed purely at the at his own support base?
His support is both economic and cultural, and even when it touches on things like immigration. I mentioned that a lot of people like the idea that Trump is a sledgehammer. He's not some fine, precise kind of tool for the job. Though part of his support came from people who felt they had been left behind economically. At the low end, wages in the United States stagnated, where those of what Charles Murray has referred to as the cognitive elite have gone up very sharply over the last 30 years. I imagine that pretty much everybody on this call are part of the people who have benefited from the last 30 years. There's a very substantial number of people who whose wages stagnated and whose standard of living relative to others declined. They felt left behind. And they felt left behind in part because substantially to do with policies from Washington. Immigration is a very important one. Part of the reason why wages at the low end declined is that a lot of low-skilled immigrants were allowed into the country, and that was something that big business was very keen to have. Big business sluices a lot of lobbying money into Washington, and I think there's a large number of blue-collar workers who saw their jobs disappearing to China and other places, who felt that they were being left behind economically and that Washington was responsible for that, and big business was responsible for that. So part of the support for immigration control was economic. But there was also a cultural aspect to this. A lot of people felt like Hillary Clinton referred to a lot of the voters who supported Donald Trump as deplorables. There was the people who support Trump see a kind of a snobbery at work in the United States. They disliked President Obama's criticism of them as clinging to religion and guns. They feel there's a certain contempt for them and a disregard for their economic interests and their values. And when people feel that they're treated with contempt, whether accurately or not, they tend to
looking forward towards the next election.
There will be a considerable intensity there. I think that Trump will. The economy has suffered hugely, as you know, over the last 3 months. The numbers of unemployed, there were 22 million people who made first-time jobless claims in April alone. Unemployment numbers will be bad. But Trump probably can make the case that he is best placed to return prosperity. The unemployment numbers will be bad, growth numbers will be bad, etc. But in the last few weeks, some very strong numbers have come out on unemployment, and yesterday were retail sales jumping by record numbers, admittedly from a very low base. And I think that in the next election, if Trump can persuade people that the election is a choice between him and Biden rather than simply a referendum on him, then he has a chance of presenting himself as the candidate most likely to restore prosperity in the way that he can claim he restored it after taking over in 2017.
Okay, and what about foreign relations? Obviously, you have an international audience here, concerned about, about trade and the US being the engine of growth for the world. And how, in terms of the impact of COVID-19, and also on, is that going to be blamed on China, and will that be the default position, and what will happen in relations with other countries?
Yeah, it is. I think blaming China for the pandemic will be a central feature of President Trump's campaign. It already is. And this, I think, will resonate because all over the world, people are reassessing their relations with China. Even if they want lots of trade, they're nevertheless, I think the pandemic has certainly made people more suspicious of China. So it may be an effective political move. The United States is, as you say, an engine of growth for the world. Some of the recent numbers suggest the possibility of a V-shaped recovery, which is to say a sharp rebound. But there's also the possibility of that those businesses which could reopen swiftly have to some extent done so, and the ones that could suggest a V-shaped recovery have already done so, and but there are lots and lots of others which are not going to be able to do that. So I think the direction and the momentum of the economy by the time the election comes around will be extremely important, not just the raw numbers. And sorry, remind me, Charles, I think I sort of derailed from your question. Was there some part of that question which I haven't answered?
Looking at relations with other countries, not only
China, right, yeah,
but also, isolationism in a way.
Yeah.
Is that going to continue?
Yeah, no, yes, I think if Trump wins, what you see now is what you'll get. He's not just doing this in order to help himself get reelected. I mean, I don't think, I thought that the presidency would change Trump, and I don't think anyone now really believes that. He will be who he is. He will continue to emphasize America first. Certainly, if Biden were in charge, one could assume he'd have better relations with many allies. He'd probably make sure that funding for the WHO was restored. He'd probably negotiate accession again to the Paris Climate Accords. There would be a much more Obama-like dispensation if Biden were elected. Yeah. Okay.
If the economy doesn't recover, will Trump concentrate on social issues, race, law and order, etc., in order to win the election, and will that be successful?
I think if the early signs of an economic rebound peter out, and the economy, he'll still emphasize that he's the person who can restore the economy, and he's got some solid things to say about that. And certainly if the Democrats get at all complacent about that, then they're making a mistake. But certainly if the economy is less effective for him because the numbers look bad, or let's say there's a second wave and things are shut down again, then he probably will have to turn more to social issues and cultural issues, simply because the other planks that he's currently he's currently using will not be as effective. Law and order is already absolutely central to his campaign. I mean, some of his his bizarre tweeting, he'll just tweet out in capital letters, law and order.
Yeah.
It's his way of reaching his 70 or 80 million Twitter followers to say, I'm the law and order guy. And so definitely that will be part of it, yeah.
All right, if we can turn briefly to Biden, can you tell us a little bit about him, his character, his base support, his allies, key advisors?
Right. Biden's been in politics for going on 4 decades.
Yes, yeah.
He's got a lot of baggage. He's tried and failed, I think twice before to get the nomination. And frankly, I didn't think that he would be successful. I mean, eventually he won, but I think that before he did, I had thought Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, and Kamala Harris all had a better chance. But you know,
Yeah.
His character is an odd one. He has, in the past, certainly since during the Obama presidency, so during the time that he was vice president, Biden has managed to cultivate very successfully the image of himself as a regular guy, a blue collar guy. There was a sort of funny meme that people spread around of him, you know, shirtless, washing his muscle car in the drive of the White House. Obviously not a real photograph. But it kind of went with his image, and I think that he's pretty well liked. He's actually quite thin-skinned. He on the trail recently, or a month or two ago, he called some woman who asked a question he didn't like as a lying dog-faced pony soldier, which struck people as extremely rude, but also very weird, and emphasized a sort of loss of control and his aging. I think that everybody recognizes, and particularly his own campaign recognizes, that his mental faculties have been in decline, and anyone who's watched the debates can see that that's so. I think that he's actually to some extent benefited from having to be not being able to get out and campaign as much. His popularity has gone up when he's been not exactly invisible, but not out there making any mistakes. And so his access to the public has been limited, and I think the campaign wants to do that. I think he's pretty popular. He's regarded as a likable guy. He's running on the fact that he's not Trump.
Yeah. And
he's running on the fact that he will, he's saying he will restore essentially the Obama style.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in a way, that makes the choice of vice president particularly important, his running mate. Can you tell us a little bit about the runners and riders and who you think will be his running mate?
Yes. I think he's pretty much agreed that if he can find the right person, he wants a woman and he wants an African American. Kamala Harris has many of the qualities that the campaign wants in a vice president. Apart from the fact that she is of mixed race and is a woman, she's also has a very dogged and aggressive way. She was a prosecutor. She's willing to go toe-to-toe with people, but being a prosecutor also makes her perhaps less attractive in this time when the police are subject of enormous protests. She's actually was referred to during her own presidential run as a cop. Elizabeth Warren is in the frame, but she's not very popular with African Americans. She's very popular with the woke left, and she's her sort of, as it were, her left-wing economic credentials are extremely strong, so she's in the frame. The mayor of Atlanta is also in the frame. She was thought very highly of for the comments that she made after the looting and smashing of businesses there. There are, let's see, Susan Rice, somewhat of a surprise, a black woman who was the national security advisor to President Obama is also in the frame. And if she is chosen, it would mean that the Democrats don't mind sort of relitigating the Benghazi affair and don't mind the role that she played in the whole Russia collusion narrative.
And who would be your favorite, or who would? Sorry, I take that back. Who do you think is going to be get the nomination, or rather get the ticket?
Gosh, I don't. I don't know that I have a favorite. I really don't. And sorry, I don't have one.
Okay. If Biden wins, what are his priorities in terms of domestic, foreign, and economic policy?
As far as foreign policy is concerned, he wants to restore relations which he and a lot of people believe have been damaged severely by President Trump. You know, he would be much more supportive, at least rhetorically, of, and I think in fact too, of multilateral organizations like the United Nations, the WHO, the Paris Accords, etc. He has one of the cardinal things that he has done in his election is support Obamacare and support the expansion of it. He doesn't support the single payer system like the NHS, which a number of his defeated rivals proposed, but he does support the expansion of Obamacare so that there is a public option if people want to buy it. So it's sort of Medicare for everybody who wants it.
Right.
That's been a big deal. Mostly he's running on not being Trump.
Yeah.
On the Obama legacy. I don't know that there's I mean, he's got a whole raft of policies, but I don't know that he doesn't hold those things really firmly, and aren't things I think he's absolutely determined to do. He's an elderly guy, and I don't think that I think part of what he feels is that it's his turn.
Yeah. Okay, before the next question, anyone who wants to ask questions, they can use the chat function, and then we'll try and get through a few of them briefly. We have about a maximum of another 10, 15 minutes. So finally, Hugo, what's going to happen in the presidential election, the Senate election, and the House of Representatives election?
Okay. I have for about a year thought that Trump would lose. And I mean, I wouldn't bet very much on this. I'm not at all confident of my prediction, but I believe that Trump will probably just be a one-term president. I put the odds of him winning at 45% and Biden at 55%. You know, states that Trump won, and which, you know, like Iowa, which I think he won by about 9 points, and now are now toss-ups. So I think that he's struggling in a lot of states that he won, and he's not looking like a winner in any states that he lost. So I think he's in danger. I think that if Trump loses, I think that there's a pretty good chance the Democrats will take the Senate. There are certainly a number of Republican senators who are in trouble. Martha McSally in Arizona is only there because she was appointed. She ran before and was defeated by Kirsten Sinema, the Democrat, who's a very strong candidate, and now she's lagging. Cory Gardner in Colorado is a very difficult state for him. That state has transitioned to a pretty clear blue. It used to be a toss-up, and not long before that it was a Republican state, but it's now pretty blue, with a liberal Democratic governor, and he's running against John Hickenlooper, who was a former governor of the state. Hickenlooper has some troubles. He's refused to give evidence in an ethics probe, which may do him some damage. But anyway, there are a number of Republican senators who are in trouble. Ironically, I mean, I think if Trump loses, the Democrats probably win the House as well. But the House is actually more of a toss-up, I think. In 2018, the Democrats won the majority largely because they fielded centrist candidates in swing districts. Also, to some extent, because they were able to redraw the map in the census in Pennsylvania. But I've spoken with Kevin McCarthy, the leader of the House Republicans, and he's and just looking at the math, there are a lot of seats which, if there were a move towards the if there were any kind of swing, it would help the Republicans take back. So I think 45% Trump loses, 55% Biden wins, 45% Republicans lose the Senate, 55% the Democrats take. But I would say 48, even 49% the Republicans take control of the House, 52, 51% the Democrats hold it.
Very, very accurate. Well done. Okay, we have a few questions from the audience. What's the likelihood that Trump will refuse to leave the White House and claim corruption and rigged elections?
Zero. I think that that's a canard, actually. I think that that's something which has been put around primarily to suggest that Trump is a would-be tyrant or something. One of the things that has really held up, people worried that the institutions, the constitutional institutions, would break down under Trump. But in fact, what has happened is that the institutions and the checks and balances have worked very well, and he has been checked in all sorts of ways by the courts, etc. I think he will cease to be president at noon on the inauguration day, and if he refuses to leave, he'll be escorted out. I don't think there's the slightest chance that he will do that.
All right. What are Trump and Biden's views on the European Union and the UK, and how will this develop after the election?
Well, I think Trump rather likes Boris Johnson. There are some differences of opinion on things, but I think that he tends to support Brexit, like Britain. I think he's not very fond of, he doesn't dislike the European Union. I don't think he has very strong views on it, but I think that he's not that much, he likes national sovereignty, and I think he's not a great supporter of the European Union, but obviously the European Union is very important to the United States in terms of trade. Joe Biden, I think, would return to the attitudes that prevailed before Trump, which is to say, to regard the European Union as a strong ally and be very much in favor of the European Union. One of the reasons the United States presidents and administrations of both colors and parties like the European Union is that they like the idea of negotiating with one body rather than with 24.
Okay, can you just talk about to what extent Trump's use of social media has increased or decreased his support? He's the first leader really to use social media on a daily basis. Well,
he has an enormous following. I think it's something like 80 million followers on Twitter. It's about, I think it's 10 times or more than what Joe Biden has. He's very good at using populist media. Now, obviously, social media is where he is probably attacked more vigorously than anywhere else as well. So, I think that social media has intensified both the dislike of him and his following. Social media tends to be more to the left. Facebook is. There are more sophisticated users of social media on the left, but Trump is very effective at it, and he will continue to use it, I think, fairly effectively.
All right. Do you think that Biden is willing and capable to make the necessary changes to prevent there being a Trump 2.0?
Do you mean to win? I'm not sure what the question means.
Yeah. All right. We'll leave that one. Do you think there's any are there going to be any real meaningful consequences of the impeachment?
Yeah. Yes, I think it will, broadly speaking, it will be it is a black mark against Trump.
Yeah.
I think that people who support, Trump supporters see it as an entirely partisan witch hunt, which is exactly what Trump calls it. I think that the evidence that has emerged about the fact that the Democrats knew for 2 years that there was no collusion, they had no evidence of collusion, will confirm those supporters of Trump in their view, and may move some independents to see that to regard the impeachment as having been unfair and just wrong. But I think that, you know, I don't think anybody apart from Trump believes that his phone call with the Ukrainian president was perfect. Oh. You know, so I think that a lot of people will see that he has done things which might be regarded as impeachable.
Will he file his tax returns, or will his tax returns be made public after he leaves office?
No, I don't think so. I suspect that he will keep them under wraps. He'll feel no obligation. I mean, some people will want to see them, but mostly people want to see them while he's president. I suspect that he will not release them.
Yeah. What actions will each of the candidates take against gun violence?
Well, I don't think that President Trump will try to do anything relating to the Second Amendment. I mean, there may be. I mean, I expect that Joe Biden will make an effort, partly because there is pressure from his base to try and limit access to the most lethal of weapons, you know, semi-automatic weapons and big magazines and things like that. So he'd likely to do that, but it's very, very difficult for him to do so. Interestingly, the Supreme Court declined to clarify gun laws. Just yesterday, this came out. So they don't want to take Second Amendment cases. Maybe that'll be a signal to Biden and to the Democrats that they can move the needle a little bit on this.
All right. I know you have another meeting in 10 minutes. So
yeah. Is
there anything finally you want to say or to wrap it up?
No, not really. I mean, I think it's going to be perhaps just this. It's already a very nasty election. It was a very nasty election the last time. It's going to become it's going to be even nastier, more vitriolic and venomous than before. I also think it's even though I would put my last dollar, I suppose, on Biden winning, I'm not at all confident of that. And an enormous amount can happen between now and then. It really depends. Does the economy show signs of strong revival, continue to show signs of strong revival, or does it kind of collapse again? And, you know, just Harold Macmillan said that the one thing that he really feared was events. In other words, things that you don't know. So there's still nearly 5 months to go. So there could be a lot of changes.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Hugo. Delighted. I think it's been a fascinating hour, and I'll talk to you privately at some time very shortly. Many thanks to everyone.
I've enjoyed it.
All right. Many thanks. Bye.